Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. So we have Dr. Tamara Houssein, and she is a child psychologist with over a decade of experience supporting young children and young people with developmental, educational, and mental health needs. Her expertise lies in leveraging cutting-edge advancements in neuroscience to enhance our understanding of learning and development. In particular, she is passionate about illuminating how our brain's biology influences every aspect of our everyday lives, which includes attention, memory, sleep, emotions, relationships, and decision making. With all of that introduction, I am going to welcome Dr. Tamara Houssein. She is going to talk to us today about anxiety and what it really is happening in our brains when our kids are feeling anxious. With that, let's welcome Tamara.
I'm glad to be here.
Yes. Okay. So we're going to be talking about a topic that highly interests me, which is brain science. But before we jump into that, can we talk about like what led you to this path, what you've been doing in your work, and what your big things are that you have going on?
Yeah, lovely. So essentially, we lead EP practice here, which is a kind of organization, um, you know, principally sort of educational psychology, sort of practice assessment, consultation. So I work with the broad remit is sort of 0 to 25, and mainly kind of doing statutory assessments, which is looking at young people, assessing their needs for the local authority, and then giving advice to schools, parents, and the local authority about the nature of those needs. So that can kind of encompass things like ASD, ADHD, learning difficulties, a range of mental health needs, very complex kind of early trauma, and neglect issues as well. So kind of a very complex mix of things that we tend to sort of, advise about. So that's kind of the broad brush, sort of work that I am doing. I also kind of, run training programs, both sort of online, virtually, as well as face to face with teachers, parents, practitioners, mainly around the area of, neuroscience, but kind of making it sort of accessible, understandable to parents, so they can utilize these approaches in everyday situations with young people who have emotional needs, autism, ADHD, a variety of needs. So that's kind of been my passion recently. I was originally kind of a secondary trained teacher, so that's kind of given me some idea of, teaching and learning, the teaching and learning process, how to sort of deal with big emotions. Obviously, at a time when I was, learning about, those approaches myself, being in teacher education, training and learning. So that's kind of given me that initial understanding, but obviously going into it, venturing myself, and learning more about it kind of made me feel like, I want to look more deeper into this. And I think in this day and age, because of the fantastic sort of developments in neuroscience and neuroimaging, and sort of looking at the brain in terms of lifting the bonnet and looking at what's inside, has shed so much light on our understanding of young people and their development. So I do training courses, as I said, and try to sort of make it accessible. So we try to sort of use a lot of imagery, metaphor, pictures, kind of bringing the complex scientific concepts to life and making it more meaningful and resonate with parents and practitioners. So that's been sort of the key drive at the moment.
Yes, I love that because I think so like understanding the science behind how the brain works just helps us to be better parents because sometimes we're fighting biology, right? We're fighting chemistry, things that are happening in our
Yes.
brain. And if we understand that that is what's happening, it's not like our kid. I mean, sometimes our kids are willful and don't want to do the things that we ask them.
Of
I mean,
course.
my kids do, at least. Yeah. And,
All
but
right. Okay.
yeah. But it's like also like noticing that, like, okay, we're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? Like, we're like,
Mhm.
there is not something rational that I'm going to say with the brain and the state that is going to work. And sometimes as parents, we like keep trying. And so I'm so excited that we're going to talk about how our brain works around anxiety today, because I think understanding that, so often our
Mhm.
kids get anxious, and I think anxiety is just a normal part of life. And so
Absolutely.
we
Yeah.
have to like learn how to, as parents, to navigate through the something that's normal but also is maybe unhelpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I like how you mentioned that, anxiety is a very common emotion that we need
Yeah.
to feel. And indeed, that's what I love when I start, thinking about emotions or talking about emotions, is that emotions have a function. And that's kind of how I approach all our training courses, that every emotion you can think of, whether anger, sadness, anxiety, are all messages or information that
Mm-hmm.
is given to our bodies in order to act in a certain way. So, I'm sure parents out there will agree that sort of, moderate amounts of anxiety when you're going into an interview situation, when you're in a new situation, is very common in neurotypical people.
Yes.
And, we as adults feel it. So it's about sort of, first and foremost, being able to, as adults, I think, acknowledge that emotions are okay. A lot of the time in our work and practices, we come across, parents who are kind of, have experienced various rearing practices when they've been parented
Mm-hmm.
as children. And they tend to feel that, we need to sort of, repeat that cycle, or kind of, just, use what we're familiar with. But sometimes it is about questioning,
Mm-hmm.
actually, how have I learned to cope with my own emotions?
Mm-hmm.
How have my experiences in my life when I was a child, and, some of the things I saw my parents doing, affected me emotionally, and made me deal with emotions in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I always like to start from that standpoint. Let's question ourselves and how we've learnt,
Mm-hmm.
emotional control, and also acknowledge that emotions are okay, and give us information about a
Mm-hmm.
variety of things in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening to a podcast, and now, of course, I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about how emotions are just chemical bursts in our brain, right? Like they're a
Yeah,
burst of chemicals, and then it tells us something. And that, as a parent, has helped me to be
yeah,
way more grounded, because it's like, it's just happening, right? Now we can do something
yeah,
different about
yeah,
how we respond to it, but this is just happening, right? Like we're
yeah.
angry, right?
That's
And
right.
mhm,
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of, when we think about neuroscience, sometimes we can get into, have this kind of misconception that it's kind of very scientific, very complex,
mhm,
or and then I kind of realized in training courses very early on that it's all about sort of using the language that, is accessible to parents,
mhm,
and kind of transferring this information in a way that, they kind of understand, from their perspective. If sometimes I can get parents to sort of think about, oh, look, we're dealing with a really primitive organ. When we think about our brain biology, and
mhm.
we're dealing with something that existed sort of 2,000 years ago, or,
Yeah,
billions of years ago. And it hasn't changed in terms of the
mhm,
processes that are going. So it is meant to be, in a sense, something that should be understandable to us. Obviously, science is making it, very, very accessible. But then, our task, I think, as teachers and educators, is to kind of lift the lid on it, and kind of making it, an accessible explanatory model. And that's where I go into things like visualization. As you
mhm.
said, Bryce, that it is all, I think you termed it, emotions are just kind of processes, aren't they? That the body goes through. And I kind of like using metaphors such as kind of clouds
Yeah,
of different colors. We bring those, lava lamps into some of our training courses, and they have little kind of bursts of different colors, floating around. And sometimes, that kind of helps us to visualize, sometimes what emotions are looking like. They're just kind of these, entities that are kind of floating around. And then if you give the bottle a shake, for example, that might be to kind of demonstrate unsettled emotions, high levels of anxiety. And then letting that kind of water rest, or those colors rest, demonstrating calm emotions. So I love bringing all that into, a kind of, explanation and discussion about emotions when we do in terms of neuroscience, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Can you tell us, okay, so when we think about anxiety, right? So what happens from like a brain science perspective adults and kids? I don't think our anxiety is really all that different, but when we're thinking about kids and anxiety happening, what's happening in a person's brain when they're feeling anxious?
Okay, so essentially, when we're feeling anxiety or any kind of, high level of emotional response that is, termed or coded as negative, our, bodies and our minds usually go into what we call a survival mode. So in this kind of mode, you're trying to sort of just, cope with the situation around you. We, in terms of a particular place for this, in terms of our brain, we call that area the amygdala, the one that sort of processes emotions and things like that, and the limbic system. So these areas kind of get flooded with things like cortisol, which are kind of chemicals, and noradrenaline and things like that, that kind of really, incite that, anxiety and high level of emotion. So it's, essentially our body goes into sort of flight, sort of high level of stress, and it really sort of suppresses that area of the brain that is responsible for thinking, reasoning, planning, and sort of calming us. And we call that kind of, broadly the prefrontal cortex. So this is kind of the front area of the brain that kind of developed much later in evolution, to kind of help human beings kind of sort through these, challenging situations, and cope with the survival mechanism. So yes, on the one hand, as we were saying earlier, survival is important when we go into a different situation, something to trigger us that, oh, wait a minute, this is a new situation and we need to now deal with it. So get ready. So yes, we will feel surges of adrenaline, as young people will, when the situations are unfamiliar. But then, what we need to do, as sort of responsible adults, is sort of try to calm ourselves, and then allow our, prefrontal cortex, effectively the thinking part of the brain, to kind of, take dominion over that, and be able to sort of instruct our amygdala, the primitive part of our brain that's sort of going into all these kind of chaotic emotions, to kind of calm. But obviously, what we find in young people, particularly with ASD or high levels of anxiety, is they simply don't have that coping mechanism. So it's, I think, really important for parents to kind of recognize that these two structures are very real in the human mind. The amygdala, the limbic system, responsible for emotional processing, which might go into sort of threat mode every now and again because of different situations. And it's the job of kind of, ourselves to kind of train our prefrontal cortex to be dealing with those difficult emotions.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking, so parents have asked me, like, why does your prefrontal cortex turn off when, or like, is kind of like put to the side when your amygdala is on? And I will give you the example I give, and you tell me if you feel like that's accurate. Is like, if we were in a really dangerous situation and a tiger just like popped out of space into our room, and we're like, oh my gosh, I wonder where that tiger came from. Wow, its paws are really big. Do you think it's from the zoo? Do you think that it's a friendly tiger? Do you think somebody owns this? If we start going into that thought, the tiger may have already swiped at us and we're we're injured, right? Seriously, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
our goal of our amygdala is to get us to safety. And the problem is that sometimes it comes on when we don't need it,
yeah, yeah.
right?
That's it.
So,
And I love that example.
Of the brain kind of needing to respond with immediacy in certain
mhm,
situations. For example, when accidents happen,
mhm,
when a child is in danger, for example, we need to sort of, in a way, remove the need to sort of overthink the situation or ask too many
mhm.
questions. We need to kind of respond very quickly, and
Yes.
and so it becomes very, absolutely critical that the brain has a mechanism where it just responds.
Mhm,
And so emotions, again, the beautiful function of emotions is that in those situations, we have that reactivity, immediate reactivity, that is responding to the threat of the situation
mhm.
rather than overthinking.
Yes.
That's a great example. We've got classic examples of a child being saved from under a heavy vehicle, and the mum kind of, having the strength to suddenly lift something very
Yes.
heavy.
Yes.
Um, Again, that's kind of the cortisol, adrenaline, and all of those
Mhm,
hormones releasing, miraculously enough, that kind of strength, so it's
mhm.
kind of inducing, a different kind of bodily response. And,
Yes.
parents kind of respond, with that level of strength that, they wouldn't have in a regular situation.
Mhm. Which is amazing. I mean, our amygdala is pretty our body, our brain is fantastic. And all the things, all the mechanisms, the things that we have set up that we don't even think about are quite fantastic. The problem is when they're responding when we don't need them. So, talk to me about okay, so the amygdala is often called the brain's alarm system, right? And
Mhm.
it we talked about that fight flight freeze kind of response. How can parents notice when their child's alarm is going off or the amygdala is getting triggered? Like what are symptoms or signs that you might look at to say like, "Oh, yes, this kid is struggling," except for them saying maybe they say they're anxious, but sometimes our kids don't say they're anxious. Like they say they're
Don't have the
fine, but their
terms.
stomach hurts, right? Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what's lovely about that is, again, sort of, that encouragement to parents, even ourselves as parents, to kind of appreciate the kind of uniqueness of their child and their
Mhm.
young person, to be sort of closely observant of, the different nuances and behaviors they sort of show, to kind of display different emotions. So anxiety sort of being one of them.
Mhm.
And obviously we've kind of, determined that, with children with developmental issues, they can have, a slightly lower threshold for various situations they experience.
Mhm.
So they go into that anxiety and flight mode more quickly than, say, a regular, child. So that kind of, your question sort of raises the importance, I guess, Bryce, of, parents really recognizing, and appreciating their individual, each
Mhm.
child's uniqueness in how they present their emotions. So that would be the first thing I would say. So, that kind of, metaphor of the alarm system or the amygdala, essentially showing that it's unsafe. How do different children demonstrate that? And it could be something simple like, shortness of breath,
Mhm.
or kind of just going quiet very quickly,
Mhm.
losing appetite. And as you say, a lot of children, especially in my line of work, do start to complain of, feeling ill,
Mhm.
to the point that they just don't want to get dressed and ready for
Mhm.
school, which is very typical. So kind of, anything that, we always think of neuroscience in terms of, patterns that, are you seeing the child behave and act in a very regular way,
Mhm.
that they normally do? But, anything outside that regulation, or outside that kind of pattern, will be something to look out for. Like, oh,
Mhm.
okay, well, something's happening, every, similar time every morning. Or, there was, my child was okay with this educational setting, but suddenly they've transferred to something
Mhm.
new. And, would expect them to, settle down, but they seem kind of, unsettled and anxious. So those, any kind of environmental situation that has necessarily kind of changed or altered, it's very important to sort of look out for those changes.
Mm-hmm.
So again, sort of, tuning into the child, what other kind of things, just, as I've said, kind of, going quiet or going up into their rooms or not, speaking or not being as expressive enough. Those are kind of very typical signs
Mm-hmm.
that a child is feeling those heightened emotions, and are kind of, reflective of their internal state. And if I kind of extend onto that, from that, a child may themselves not know that they're actually feeling anxious,
Mm-hmm.
because they can't kind of label their emotions. That's a typical scenario that we see quite often, that, they might suddenly burst into tears,
Mm-hmm.
and the situation is looking quite normal.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be the child is responding to something that's happened like 8 hours before, and
Mm-hmm.
but then suddenly that feeling arises and makes them anxious in terms of, oh, I need to go to school tomorrow, and they're, kind of, so, that delayed reaction makes it very difficult,
Mm-hmm.
understandably, for parents to actually make that connection that, oh, it might be for that or this reason. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say, look out for patterns and anything kind of, working outside that pattern, of normality for your child, and then tuning in absolutely would be the key at that point.
Yeah. And in my practice, I see a lot of kids that are anxious and they might have trouble sleeping. That sometimes, right? Like being able to turn their
Yes.
brain off, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's anxiety. It could be ADHD,
Yeah.
it could be ASD, right? Like there's a lot of other things but it could be anxiety.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it becomes really important to sort of delineate what is it in this
Mm-hmm.
situation? Am I overreacting? And I guess, we'll come to that later, but that really ties in with then what, approaches we use as parents when we, feel, those subtle signals.
Mm-hmm.
Do we kind of just respond and ask heaps of questions, or do we kind of, until we're definite, we're certain, kind of model a sense of calm, a
Mm-hmm.
sense of dependability? That's really important to, for adults to continuously model those, calm emotions.
Yeah.
And that's where, young people learn to kind of co-regulate, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure you'll agree with that,
Yeah.
it's so much about what the adult is doing at
Yeah.
that time as well.
Yeah. Which is hard because sometimes our kids are in a circumstance or we're in a circumstance where we're stressed too. We're at the airport, the flight is delayed or we're late or e- everybody's taking too long or
Yeah.
needs to go to the bathroom or whatever it is, right? That
Yeah,
seems
yeah.
to happen.
Those things happen. Yeah.
Yes. And then you're like, oh, right. Like I'm so frustrated. But then, our kids are looking for us to model what we're doing. Right. So
Yeah.
I know that I am a master breather. I love box breathing. So it's like I'm
Oh,
breathing
beautiful.
in, holding it, breathing out, holding it because I'm like, I need to stay calm. Right. And I
Yeah.
think it is so hard sometimes when our kids are having big emotions to not
Yeah.
also like join the train. Right. To like,
Oh god, yeah, yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, so that's a very regular practice, and traditionally we tend to see that kind of pattern of choice with a lot of parents and parenting techniques. Oh, my parents had a good shout at us, and everything was fine. In some situations, raising that tone of voice or showing a firm voice, might be helpful to that situation,
mm-hmm,
but it's all about, I don't know if you'll agree, Bryce, but that level of control around emotions,
mm-hmm,
or adults modeling control more than anything else. Obviously, as adults, we've given far more time to kind of evolve and develop, our
sure.
way of coping with
Mm-hmm,
emotions. And in an ideal world, we've been raised by parents who demonstrated calm emotions, being able to regulate from situations that are chaotic and stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And they've continuously kind of modeled that to us. And that's kind of demonstrated to us, how to cope with our own emotions. And we've got these things, for example, and the beauty of neuroscience, we learn about sort of mirror neurons,
Mm-hmm.
which are neurons that kind of emulate and copy and mimic, what has been, what they've seen previously or what's
Mm-hmm.
been experienced previously. So I think the reason to kind of raise that is, children are observant continuously. They're continuously observant
Mm-hmm.
of our actions, our choices. There is actually, scientifically, if I can sort of throw it in, there are certain waves that, a brain is sort of undergoing in childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And these waves, I think they're called theta waves, but do look it up, kind of indicate that the brain is kind of at that point sort of open to sort of copying, mimicking,
Mm-hmm.
watching, being observant, and assimilating the world around
Mm-hmm.
them. So those waves are very, very prevalent during, the childhood period, for a very functional reason, that they're really, they're taking in,
Mm-hmm.
um, and acting or making choices less. So it becomes so imperative for parents and adults to be able to model, those very appropriate emotions particularly at those points of stress. And I understand, parents and, including ourselves, we can feel stressed and then act inappropriately
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, make those, become overly stressful. But how do we then wind down from it would
Mm-hmm.
be the key, but we're not, sort of displaying that we not only can get into these, very heightened levels of emotions, but we can also deregulate ourselves, and, through things like self-talk, or,
Mm-hmm.
reassuring ourselves, or just sitting down and taking time out. And all of that is, hugely educational, to children,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of how to deal with emotions, really.
Yeah. Well, and I think as a parent, there's a lot of times that I'm just like saying out loud, like, wow, I'm feeling really stressed or I'm upset about how this went. And this is what I'm going to do because,
Wow. Yep.
sometimes my kids are watching for sure. But I find that, especially when I'm doing a really great job of
Yeah.
keeping myself together, right? Like staying calm, being able to work through it. Excuse me. I feel like it's good for me to put the words to it because then they see that part. And
Yeah.
I've then seen my kids do that to each other. Like, I'm mad at you right now. I'm going to take some space, right? Or I'm going outside. And
Yeah.
sometimes like I like to walk when I feel big feelings. I feel like movement helps me. And so I will be like, okay, we're going on a walk, and everybody does it. And they might be like, why are we walking right now? Right? Like, I thought we were getting ready to have dinner. And I'm like, yep, we were, but I need to walk around the block and you're going to come with me
Yeah.
because I was feeling this feeling. Right. So I think
Yeah.
it's modeling it, but it also, we can put words to it. And I think our kids are wanting those examples.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. And it's such a great example. I think of, parents kind of being able to model those emotions, using that self-talk to self-calm. And it's great that your kids then, start to emulate you, and start
Mm-hmm.
to use that self-talk and dialogue between themselves. And it's a work in process, and
Yeah.
sometimes, parents can be, oh, I've modeled it and it might not work. But it's kind of, if we continuously remind ourselves that children are constantly assimilating
Mm-hmm.
the information that we're giving them, and to then practice later on in time. Hopefully, round two or round three might not be great. They feel those emotions again, and they sort of
Mm-hmm.
go into, you know feel a sense of drama, or feel a sense of, I can't cope with this. It takes time for them to really develop those skills, and
Sure.
continuous kind of modeling and observation.
Mm-hmm.
The great sort of field of research that is coming out now is really about actions driving emotions as well. Um, we've got this big body of research that kind of shows us that, look, when you're feeling these emotions, it's so much about being able to mobilize ourselves, or act, and through that action, the process of dealing with those emotions become easy. So for example, with breathing, or self-talk, sometimes children can be challenging and saying, oh, but I don't want to do that, or
Mhm.
I don't want to do this, or I don't want to go out right now, or I don't want to walk. And sometimes thinking carefully about, yes, let them give them some time to sort of rest, but actions actually precede emotions a lot of the
Mhm.
time. So
Mhm.
if you kind of carry out actions that induce those positive emotions like serotonin, dopamine, and things like that, by going out for that walk, or kind of sort of intentionally kind of breathing calmly, that can help to induce those chemicals from emerging a lot more faster than if you decide that you just want to sort of feel the emotion. So
Mhm.
actions actually sometimes precede emotions, and that's to that kind of helps us to kind of mobilize ourselves and encourage children to sort of start to mobilize in dealing with those difficult emotions, and sort of being able to say, oh, look, on the other side, you might actually feel better, and
Hmm.
feeling confident to be able to say
Mhm.
that, because sometimes we can be a little bit reserved, and in terms of, well, I really don't want to get the child to do this, I don't know what the outcome will be. Well,
Mhm.
generally, if you take it to towards positive steps, like, oh, we want to go out, get some fresh air, and breathe, and start to walk, those actions can actually mobilize those positive emotions, and that's a really important one for parents, I think, to think about.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so talk to me about, like, I'm thinking about with families. So we might have a kid who is more prone to anxiety, but maybe not all of our kids are prone to anxiety. Like, why are some kids, I mean, maybe more biologically wired? I don't know, but like some kids experience more anxiety than maybe even my own other kids, or than their cousin or their friend. Why does that happen?
Yeah, so we can say that, emotions are really shaped by, like you say, genetics, biology, just how, their particular limbic system is. They tend to feel emotions more deeply. You can also think of the antithesis to that, in that, sometimes, the environment that we experience
Mhm.
is very much an environment generally directed, and designed for neurodevelopmental, um, typical young people, or sort of mainstream, if you like, whatever you call it. So
Mhm.
when you, for example, young people are in an environment where there's a lot of clutter, for example, some children might respond a little bit more anxiously towards that,
Mm.
or some situations where there's loud noises, and
Yeah.
so it could be, yes, they have a biological predisposition to feeling heightened emotions or deeper emotions, but
Mhm.
also the environment can also be a trigger to exacerbate that. And as we see time and time again, when you remove those barriers, like when you kind of remove the clutter, or move them to a situation where it's sort of quieter,
Mhm.
they calm down a little bit more. I guess that illustrates the importance of, again, really understanding the nuances of every young person, that celebrating their uniqueness, and really thinking, yes, they feel bigger emotions, but it could just be that that situation, is, sort of triggers that, and how can
Mhm.
I plan my day, or situations, or experiences, so we have less of an impact on that, while kind of training the child to think, um, that, oh, let's just practice dealing with situations, For example, there might be a crowded situation, and we might decide not to sort of take the child into that big crowd, but maybe, a smaller crowd of people, and get them to, help them to desensitize from that emotion, but slowly, in a
Mhm.
kind of very understanding and empathetic way. So yes, they're very anxious in crowds, but that kind of very minor safe exposure to small numbers of crowds may make them feel like, oh, actually, this isn't too bad. So by all means, parents should be alert to what their nuances are, but also be able or be ready to kind of experiment with different
Mhm.
situations with young people, and think, oh, can I give this my child some opportunities where they practice, dealing with that anxiety, by this kind of, brief periods of exposure to obviously accompanying that would be what I would say is, the importance of continued connection,
Mhm. Yeah.
modeling calmness, um, being able to sort of, offer that reassuring and empathetic
Mhm.
approach as well.
Yeah.
So I think, those approaches are important.
Yeah. Well, and something I was thinking, it's like, so sometimes I'll see families or parents where, and to be honest, like there have been times where I've wanted to do this as a parent too, is to accommodate the anxiety. So it's like a thing that makes my kid anxious is going to birthday parties. This isn't for one of my children, but thinking about a kiddo that I saw, they get anxious at birthday parties, and so does mom go and stay the whole time? Does mom not send them to the birthday party? Right, like where I'm just making it, or like drop offs are hard, so I'm gonna walk you in, whatever it is. Like dogs make you nervous, so we're never gonna go anywhere where there's a dog, right? Like, is it good for us to accommodate the anxiety, or do we need to be pushing kind of against it?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think, that's something that really repeatedly comes up in, a lot of, consultation with parents about, I'm really struggling. Should I give up,
Mhm.
family pastimes and experiences because of my child?
Yeah.
I've had to give up this. And, I always kind of, um, sort of tell parents to, um, on the one hand, make those accommodations, and that not kind of necessarily expose them off the bat, with these, challenging situations, but, use that principle of pacing, what they do get exposed to,
Mhm.
over time, teaching them to cope. I think the important thing I try to instruct in is what we call psychoeducational approaches. So at a time when the child isn't feeling anxious or heightened emotions, is there, a way you can educate them about those big feelings when
Mhm.
they're actually not feeling them?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you're kind of dealing with, situations, daily life in a practical way,
Mhm.
but in the background, you're also educating young people in how to deal with those emotions, say through, have you heard of social stories and
Mhm.
um, comic strip conversations where, you kind of read stories to a young child that, more or less kind of depicts the scenarios that they experience,
Mhm.
and then how to cope. So you might have a character who is similar to the child in the story, and they, are kind of being dropped off to a party. They're kind of feeling really anxious about being in there,
Mhm.
and they don't want to go in, and you kind of get the characters to sort of, face this dilemma, but
Yeah.
find a resolution that, oh, well, mummy put on a timer, and, she's kind of said, or we're only going to do this for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. We're going to stand there and then come straight out. And when the timer's off, we can, just come out and, kind of breathe, and see how that was.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's what I would do with a social story. When the situation is non-threatening, educate about that experience. And as a parent, I'm sure you could think of very, typical scenarios that your child goes through, whether it's in the shopping mall or
Mm-hmm.
whether it's in school or whether it's at a party or a neighbor's house or time with relatives.
Mm-hmm.
Can we turn these little experiences into sort of lessons and training for the young person to do at a time when they aren't feeling those emotions, through things like storytelling,
Mm-hmm.
pictures and images, until the child starts to kind of, in the background, at least their mind begins to sort of cope, and they start this kind of dialogue and narrative with themselves that,
Mm-hmm.
oh, this is okay, the characters dealt with it, maybe I can try that.
Mm-hmm.
And it encourages them to sort of experiment with the situation when they're in it.
Yeah.
So the key thing is to have that sort of educational modeling, at a time when they're not feeling those emotions at all,
Yes. Yep.
while putting some provisos in place when you actually face those experiences. So I think that dual approach, I would imagine, is highly effective, if you can sort of help support your children that
Mm-hmm.
way.
When we're talking about the brain, our amygdala will respond the same, whether it is actual danger, so real alarm, or if it's a false alarm. So it's the same regardless, because the amygdala is a reacting part versus a thinking part. And so something I was thinking about in this like educational piece you were talking about is like doing things when kids are not activated or not upset or anxious, to talk about the skills, because if they're able to be calm and think about like, oh, this is what I could do, rehearsing that or practicing it, then when the real situation comes up where they're having anxiety, then they're going to be more likely to use that skill.
Yeah, yeah. And that's actually a really great point, because I think that is kind of the crux of a lot of our, education to parents, about training,
Mm-hmm.
essentially brain training, training the brain to sort of think in a certain way, if you like. Because, I think the more recent narrative has been about the brain doesn't quite understand the difference between what is real or imaginary. So, even if you were to visualize or, discuss an event, that is happening, and then problem solving through that situation, even in a kind of role play type of way,
Mm-hmm.
over time, the brain kind of is learning how to manage it, even though
Mm-hmm.
you're not in the situation.
Yeah.
So it's so important, neuroscientifically, for parents to recognize that, all these approaches that I use, even though the children aren't immersed at that particular point in
Mm-hmm.
that situation, their brain essentially is being educated, about how to cope with that. And
Yeah.
that happens with repetition, exposure, continuous exposure from day to day, but about how to deal with the situation, coping, as you say, at a time when they're already quite calm. Let's practice breathing today.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if we can sort of activate our breathing when a situation comes up. Look, I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to test you. I'm going to kind of, we're going to work with this. I'm going to kind of
Mm-hmm.
experiment with it. So when you model those things at a time when that threat isn't there, you are
Mm-hmm.
essentially, brain training, and so that becomes ever so important, and that particular point about not knowing the difference between what's false and what's real, that's very,
Mm-hmm.
very potent, in terms of getting young people mobilized into taking action. I will do this, and when I do it, I will see that results are happening,
Mm-hmm.
because my brain has learned to cope with it in a more sort of constructive way.
Yeah, totally.
Definitely.
Love it. The other thing I was going to say on the, I love therapeutic stories or bibliotherapy, right? Where we're kind of talking about going through it. One of the, I guess, cheat codes that I've used recently, because I've had some kids have some really unique stuff and I was like writing them, but AI is actually really helpful for writing therapeutic stories. You can kind of
Oh
put
yeah.
in what the situation is. And like, I like animal kind of things. I feel like that imagery interests kids more. And so then I'll like draw out the pictures, but then I don't have to spend the time writing the story. But then I can like send it home with parents. And then that's a very personalized story for that kid that is like trying to overcome a particular thing or has been exposed to a particular thing. And so like, I don't know, that's been something that's been really helpful for me in my practice, to be able to really tailor the stories to kids so that they feel like that story is really speaking to them.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think therapeutic stories, correspond to, earlier when I was talking about social stories. I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
those, yeah. So one and the same thing, but a beautiful way to sort of put it. I think therapeutic stories has, such great resonance in that we know it's kind of like particular strategies to actually calm and counsel the young person. So absolutely, and I think therapeutic stories can turn into role plays.
Mm-hmm.
I love, suggesting role plays, which is a little bit
Yes.
daring, and a little bit sort of, kind of on the edge with parents, like, oh, do I feel comfortable with this?
Mm-hmm.
But again, if you come across as sort of calm and confident, and like, we're just going to have a bit of a session, where we're kind of, you imagine you're in a situation, I'll imagine that sort of I'm helping you or calming you down. That kind of sort of enacting that
Mm-hmm.
scenario again, that makes it more real, because in a sense it's more kinesthetic, it's more kind of practical.
Yeah.
And obviously the brain learns, yes, through visualization and talking, but also by action.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can sort of get up and imagine you're walking into this kind of large hall with lots of people,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then are you sort of feeling these big emotions? Oh, look, that threat isn't really there. We don't see anybody around us, but then you might imagine that you're going to feel very anxious. So what would you do in that situation?
Mm-hmm.
Again, it just brings things more to life. So
Mm-hmm.
definitely kind of visualization, sort of storytelling, role plays is definitely something that parents can not only do to educate, but actually have a bit of fun with it,
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Um, and those types of things, I don't know if you'll agree, create connection, if you like, indirectly
Yeah.
create connection between
Mhm.
young people and parents.
Yes. And provide support, right? That we're like there with them, that this isn't just like Bryce's problem, right?
Yeah.
We're here as part of their team, right? Like we want them to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think children really appreciate that. They like parents to be able to, or adults to be able to say, this is a time when I felt big emotions. This is
Hmm.
how I dealt with it. Or,
Hmm.
actually, I didn't deal with it, in a
Hmm.
way that kind of helped me. It was quite challenging. And to be able to admit and be authentic about those
Hmm.
experiences is absolutely imperative in that education. And so sometimes young people can feel a bit deflated, like, why do I feel this emotion, why
Hmm.
do I feel anxiety every time getting ready for school, and they might not even be able to explain it. And that's where the neuroscience is actually so helpful, because you're actually talking about how your body's feeling, and
Hmm.
then the child can sort of distance themselves from their actual biological processes and say, okay, wait a minute, my body's actually going through this. I think I am, but in fact, it's my biology and my physiology that is experiencing this. And how can I, be the leader over it? How
Hmm.
can I be the boss? So it gives them, I think learning about neuroscience and brain kind of mobilizes them and helps them to sort of take command and
Hmm.
agency, I guess, over those really big emotions.
Yeah.
Um, so absolutely, actually encouraging parent, we do that in our training courses, sort of encouraging parents to start having those dialogues and start talking about brain imagery,
Hmm.
coloring in different parts of the brain, saying what this area is responsible for,
Hmm.
the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, and labeling it, talking about it, and maybe even kind of characterizing it, like so I've had different picture books where the amygdala is represented like a really kind of anxious, a ball of anxiety, an
Mm-hmm.
image that kind of depicts that. And the prefrontal cortex is like envisioned as, sort of some kind of a chief or a commander who's,
Mm-hmm.
very much in control and,
Yeah.
directing everybody, what to do. They feel this threat, but, they stay calm. So, all this, can be enacted in very kind of amusing ways. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very enlightening for, parents to, be able to, have these resources at hand to be able to talk about anxiety to their young people.
Yeah, for sure. So something I was thinking about is also, you kind of touch on this a little bit, but about being able to name our emotions. That seems like an important piece, right? So like if I'm feeling something and I don't know what I'm feeling, it's going to be really hard for me to use tools to kind of come away or down from that. Like if I'm just like lots of, maybe I'm feeling angry, but I'm just like, I want to punch something and kick things and whatever.
Yeah.
Is naming our emotions help to tame them?
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it sort of goes hand in hand with that idea earlier that sometimes, young people just launch into emotions,
Hmm.
particularly if we see a neurodiverse profile of child, they feel these big emotions, but, half the time they're not really labeling them or understanding where in the body they're coming from, or that they're even occurring. And you can see in some children, they sort of overcome that stage at some point. They feel this incredible remorse, or
Hmm.
kind of, oh, I shouldn't have acted up that way, that
Yeah.
was inappropriate.
Hmm. Hmm.
Obviously we know, as kind of more informed people, that obviously when the emotions calm down, it's when the prefrontal cortex starts to make sense of what just
Hmm.
happened, and
Hmm.
they're trying to reason with it. So again, sort of, yes, absolutely. We call them sort of emotional labeling. When you kind of are able to say, what does sadness, look like, or what,
Hmm.
what's happiness. Um, we can do that with showing facial expressions and then labeling it or modeling
Hmm.
it with our own expressions. Another thing I like to say to educators and parents is trying to pair that emotion with an experience. So, say the
Hmm.
child is jumping on a trampoline, you're saying, "Oh, you look like you're feeling excited right now."
Hmm.
Like you've actually, kind of labeled that emotion in terms of something concrete and
Yeah.
tangible. That
Yes.
excitement, can be linked with, jumping on a trampoline.
Hmm.
So as they're kind of feeling that emotion and jumping and, feeling that level of excitement, you've labeled it as well for
Hmm.
them. So again, emotions, particularly when they're very young, are very fuzzy. They're kind of like, oh, where are they happening? What are
Hmm.
they? How do I understand them? But if you start to link them to very concrete experiences day to day, as they're kind of going through the ebb and flow of daily activities, it becomes much more real to them. And then they will, hopefully, label similar experiences with similar emotions,
Yeah.
and appropriately as well.
Hmm. And I find that that happens. My 3-year-old will be like, "You make me so mad," right? Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
he's naming it. So I think little kids can do it too, because sometimes parents will say like, "Oh, well, my kid's not old enough to do that." And I
yeah,
think, really tiny kids, yes, that like a 1-year-old, right? Like we don't have the language yet, probably, to be able to do that. But
yeah,
as we're developing by the talking about it, we're modeling that. And if there's other siblings, they're modeling that, right? And then that's going
yeah.
to make it more concrete of like, when this set of feelings happens, this is this word to describe it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And as adults, sometimes, as parents, again, going back to that kind of role of parents, there might be some reservation in kind of doing that in some families, because of, again, their kind of understanding of child rearing
Mhm.
practices or what they've experienced themselves in childhood. But emotions are becoming far more recognized now
Mhm.
as mobilizers, or things that inhibit. So and very much underlying most activities that we're doing day to day, and most of the experiences we have in educational home life and the community. So I think that recognition is
Mhm.
emerging a lot more. So it's kind of encouraging parents to be able to not be, to sort of kind of break free from that reservation, be able to talk
Mhm.
about emotions very openly,
Yeah.
in the household environment, because that modeling is the absolute key to then um, the child being able to not only label their emotions, but increasingly effectively deal with those
Mhm.
challenging emotional experiences in day-to-day life.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm thinking about with anxiety and parents, like, I think, where they tend to do well is like if we put emotions on a range, right? So like 0 would be none of a feeling, 1 would be like, let's say anxiety, the least anxiety you could feel, 10 would be the most. When kids are like 4 or less, parents tend to do pretty well helping their kids navigate those kind of things, or they're not maybe causing the kid as much distress. But what I find is where parents seem to get stuck is when their kid is like 7, 8, 9, 10, and they're really big. What and what's hard for me, even as a practitioner, is like sometimes we get to a point when you're like at a 9 or 10, it is really hard to bring somebody down. And a lot of times parents want to like talk their kids through it, to like rationalize. But as we learned earlier, when our amygdala is on, our thinking part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex that's going to make decisions and like think through things, is not online. So, what should we do differently in those times where
Yeah,
we're having the big emotions?
yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I think, in young children, it becomes much more easier to talk about these emotions. It's first and foremost kind of acknowledging that children go through a developmental curve. The neuroscience, for example, that we teach about young people 0 to 5 years old is kind of different from the neuroscience that is going on when they turn into teenagers and
Mhm.
adolescents, and therefore the approaches used in each of those age periods need to shift a little bit.
Mhm.
And we need to be sort of open to that shift. So sometimes what we see in older children is the propensity to kind of challenge boundaries and challenge what we learned, and
Mhm.
that's all part of development, that kind
Mhm.
of risk taking, and trying to express emotions in different ways. So
Mhm.
not only should we be able to sort of adapt to our child, but also adapt to our child over their developmental period, up into late adolescence, because as we know from neuroscience, the brain is changing
Mhm.
physically very potently over those periods. And big emotions, bigger emotions in response to similar situations might be happening later on in life in a more profound way. So again, I think sometimes, I think you raised a good point about words, and sometimes, understanding that, that talk, won't be as helpful. That
Mhm.
kind of propensity to kind of talk through that emotion, and try to reason won't be as effective when they're going
Mhm.
into these big meltdowns. I think when we make recommendations for children with high levels of what we call SEMH, or social emotional behavioral needs, when they're sort of kicking around, when they're punching walls, when they're going underneath tables, and, just being very oppositional, maybe even physical,
Mhm.
it's very important to create a safe environment generally. Number one, for adults to kind of continue to model calm, but remove obstacles, remove anything dangerous, remove anything that they might climb onto,
Mhm.
or close sort of doors that they might sort of sort of dash out of. So it's very important to just make the environment safe while modeling that kind of calmness. And giving that child a kind of safe space. Sometimes we call it sensory spaces. I don't know what it's termed over there, where you might have a space where, if it's a particular child that has similar profile of needs, what is it that they enjoy? It could be that they enjoy Lego, bit of Lego. It could be that they enjoy sort of something fidgety, like a tactile item, a bit of dough ball or something, or they just want to punch a bag. Do you have things in the environment that could kind of allow them that space to do all that, but in a safe way? So yeah, we have this kind of trend around sensory spaces or sensory rooms where they can climb or jump from soft climbing equipment, for example. They can fidget with things. Sometimes their skin enjoys feedback, and so we give them sort of scrunchy things, or sort of spiky balls or things like that. So again, sort of tuning into what that is. That it could even be drawing. An outlet for a lot of children is kind of drawing or coloring. As I learned about yesterday in a consultation, a young person really enjoys just coloring, and that just makes them feel like they're in the zone.
Nice.
So so yeah, so is there a space we can just pluck out a few pencils and some coloring sheets and offer that? And you might not even use words to kind of help that transition. As an adult, think creatively. Can you start sort of coloring, and then the child might what we call redirect the child and say, oh, I'd like to do that. And then they generally sort of wind down and realize that they'd like to do something like that that's calming. So I think actions speak volumes in those moments where a child is particularly very, very heightened. They're going into physical mode. Very important to create a very safe environment, not just physically but emotionally. Not kind of react or use too many words. Sometimes that can kind of escalate the situation. But think about how your actions, your body, your demeanor, your body language, what it is communicating, and create use that to create a safe space, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so let's end with, when you're thinking about, like, now that we have some more information about how the brain works in this time of anxiety, what do you think are the parenting practices that, like, let's say we have a more anxious child and we've been struggling to help them regulate themselves. What are the things that you want parents to take away that we could, like, immediately implement that would help our kids either to become more resilient against anxiety or to cope with anxiety when it happens?
Okay. No, that's a really good one. And I think, first and foremost, it's again, how are we feeling in our bodily state right then and there? Because I think the first step to managing anxiety and high emotions is connection. Connection is the number one key. So, in order to connect, our bodily state has to sort of, model this kind of calmness. Are we breathing? A child may be in some kind of unsafe mode, physically, but, are we kind of breathing? Are we regulated? Are we ready for this? Are we okay with this?
Yeah.
We, and telling ourselves we can be okay with this, we can be okay with anything. And then that allows you to then be open for connection. Because if you think about it, when we talk about co-regulation, we're talking about the child matching what our emotions are. We're not trying to match the emotions of the child. Sometimes, it happens in secondary schools
Yes.
where
Yeah.
you see that, teacher trying to sort of, shout back, use a loud voice, and, it just escalates the situation.
Yep.
So the sort of preconception is, well, if I kind of use a louder voice, they're going to, um, sort of desist or whatever. But in those points where the child is heightened, it really can't regulate, we need to model regulation. And
Mhm.
that is essentially the child starting to match our heart rate,
Mhm.
our rate of breathing, our physiological processes. When they start to sort of match it, then we're on the right way, we're on the right
Mhm.
path with it. The second one is, again, connected to the first one, is co-regulation. So you make that connection with the child, again, by doing something, kind of just showing understanding, giving them space, perhaps, a bit of coloring or whatever they enjoy, and then co-regulating with them. And that might be, a few minutes of silence, a few minutes of breathing together, and then doing those things to kind of calm that emotion down. The next one is really, really important. That This is about predictability and routine.
Mhm.
Trying to establish, and this becomes ever so much more important in young children with neurodiversity, anxiety, ADHD. Predictability is great for all of us. Routines are great for all of us, but even
Yep.
more so with children with high levels of anxiety, because often that anxiety, I was recently reading, is induced because the environment becomes uncertain
Mhm.
and out of their control. And in fact, that's why most of us essentially feel anxiety, because we've lost control over our environment.
Yeah.
So the way to kind of reclaim that, or at least how to mitigate that and allow adults to kind of manage that, is to give predictable routines.
Hmm.
Um, um, on the other hand, sort of educating them about change, again through those therapeutic stories, through social stories, at a time when those anxieties aren't happening. That yes, I will give you predictable routines, but let me also educate you for times when things might be a bit unpredictable, a bit
Mhm.
haywire, a bit out there. Let me educate you about, it's okay, we can cope through that as well. Because sometimes we have this tendency to sort of keep children in a bubble and think, oh, they're very anxious, let's not allow for any change, we need
Mhm.
to, which is good in a sense, offering that predictability. But inevitably in life, things will happen that is
Yes.
unexpected or disappointing. And we certainly, there's some children who don't like losing. They don't like, they don't like that they've not won in a game or something like that. Or they're working with a team and the team didn't do as well as they could, or something like that. So
Mhm.
educating that disappointments, mistakes and problems and unexpected situations are very much part of that. We should be in an active process of educating, as well as offering that predictability and routine. And I think ultimately, modeling continuous coping mechanisms, taking it at every stride, that yes, I've got my routines in place, I'm co-regulating, I'm connecting, but every day continuously I'm going to model, so that I'm kind of ready for when things go wrong, or things a bit
Mhm.
out of expected situations.
Sure.
I'm constantly ready to adapt and be flexible when my young
Mhm.
person does show emotions.
Yeah. Well, and I think also just remembering that emotions are normal, right? All of this is normal.
Absolutely.
We have them too, right? There are times
Mm.
where, I have a feeling about something and maybe somebody else doesn't, but that doesn't invalidate the experience that I'm having. It's still real for me. But
Mhm.
I think all of the things that you listed are just so important. And it's hard. Look, I think parenting literally the hardest job we have.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, even with the
Absolutely.
information, it is still hard. Like, I have endless amounts of information, right? And
Yeah.
I am capable of learning new things, but it's still challenging me. I joke that I'm still in clinicals now,
Yeah.
even though I finished those a long time ago, but I made my own clinicals at my house. And my
Wow.
kids are teaching me a lot of things, right? Like, and I think, I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that there are times that it's easy, but I'm hoping that it gets easier. And it does, and it changes. And like, this is part of the process, I think, of just being a human, is that things are not going to happen as expected most of the time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you've addressed a really good point that I am keen on kind of relaying as well, which is about the fact that emotions sort of exist in ourselves constantly, and
Yeah.
there is a kind of ebb and flow of emotions
Mm-hmm.
that even though the situation might not be triggering it, our bodies are going through different emotional states constantly. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you might be waking up, there is nothing that you need to be worrying about, but you're on an emotional low. It probably means that dopamine and cortisol, dopamine levels are a little bit low, like at the happy chemicals at that certain point in the day. It's got
Mm-hmm.
nothing to do with the situation.
Yeah.
At other times, you might feel fear. You don't quite know why. It probably, doesn't even matter. It's just, the ebb and flow of emotions. And that's
Yeah.
something we really, really need to acknowledge as adults, that it's okay to go, through those ebb and flow.
Mm-hmm.
And then just to, I don't know if you know the term ride it out, ride the
Mm-hmm.
wave.
Yes.
And children sort of need to, that's again a metaphor you can use with kids, like,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to ride the wave, it's going to come. So yes, these emotions are happening, and I guess it's a way of us practicing how to manage them day to day, so that when
Mm-hmm.
big situations do happen and those big emotions are happening, you're kind of, you used to kind of riding that wave and
Yeah.
responding to them. But essentially it's kind of to be able to feel them when they come and be okay with it
Yes.
as well.
Yes. Which is hard, but so important, because we don't want to put them
Absolutely.
in our invisible backpack, right? We don't want to start putting things back there and not dealing with them.
Oh,
So
easily done, easily done.
yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, thank you
Again,
so
no
much.
worries.
Yes, this has been such a great conversation, such good information. Anything that you want parents to leave with that we didn't already cover?
Yeah, that's it. And I think, that really good point. I think in your excerpts, you talk about neuroplasticity. It's always kind of continuously remembering that, children can change, they will
Hmm.
change. Sometimes parents, oh, this is just how my child is, the kind of
Hmm.
narrative. And that's understandable because of that frustration. But what one of the most potent thing that neuroscience, I think, teach us is, above all, is that the brain is plastic. It is a
Yes.
mechanism that continuously changes
Mhm.
as a result of experience, and therefore you're in the incredible driving seat where you can shape the child's brain. So every particular moment that transfer that is positive and instructional and valuable is actually making a very physical
Mhm.
change to their brains at every
Amazing.
moment. So yeah, that's why these strategies are so important to sort of practice and become part of your routine.
Yeah. Love it. Well, thanks again, Dr. Tamara. This has been like just so wonderful just to
I'm
hear
really
the
glad. Yeah.
the science behind it and help our kids.
Brilliant. Really enjoyed chatting, and yeah, and all the parents, best to parents out there. And thank you, Bryce.
Thanks again for all that information, Dr. Tamara. And also, thank you for your time today. Please rate and subscribe to our show. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And before you check out today, if you would hit the subscribe button, that would be great. And also share this episode with anybody whose kids are anxious to help them greater understand what happens in our anxious brain. With that, I will say have a wonderful day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.